Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So on our webinar on the impact of REMA on the business cases, both for renewables and flexible assets. Some of you might be aware this is a follow-on event from our previous REMA event, which took place in person earlier this year in September, and we had great attendance. Your speakers today will be myself, Vikash, and Tom. So as you know, REMA is a very broad set of measures and will not be able to cover everything today. So in today's webinar, we will focus on the wholesale market reform as well as the capacity market reform. And on the wholesale side, a lot of the debate has focused on nodal pricing. And today we will focus on zonal pricing and some quantification around that, because we believe that this is the more likely model which will emerge from REMA. So if we turn to the agenda, I will give a brief introduction to the policy context in the UK, which a lot of you are familiar with. Then Tom will discuss the impact of zonal pricing on renewables. Vikash will discuss the impact of zonal pricing and capacity market reforms on flexible assets. And finally, we will discuss the impacts on interconnected markets. Jen, I think you might want to go back to the slides. Yeah. So in terms of questions, we will leave some time for Q&A at the end. So please share your questions in the chat box and we'll try to cover them all. And if we don't have time to cover them all, then we'll get back to you separately on those. So now a brief introduction to the speakers. I'm a director at Baringa and I lead a lot of the commercial analysis we do for renewables here in the UK, but also internationally. Here in the UK, a very big part of focus for me is the CFD regime and the CFD analysis. And my team, we've just published a piece on REMA and the future, which it may, the future impact on the CFD regime and some future evolutions. Vikash leads our GB power market practice. He monitors the evolutions of policies in the market and he helps our clients understand the impact. He also helps our clients deploy capital in an uncertain context. And finally, Tom is our expert power market modeler, and he has been the lead quantitative modeler for all aspects, which we will talk about in this webinar. So now if we do a bit of market context, which, yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with, the GB market has seen many waves of reforms over the years, the latest one being the EMR in the early 2010s. The EMR introduced the CFD mechanism and the capacity market and was a real bedrock of the electricity market over the last 10 years. Both of those schemes were very successful at bringing about the first wave of decarbonization. You've had in that time quite a lot of market shocks, in particular with Brexit, with COVID, and with the war in Ukraine. Now we have a lot of renewables on the system, and therefore the system needs to be adapted for the second wave of decarbonization and the next stages of that. And that's what REMA is about. So REMA was introduced in 2022. It's a very wide-ranging set of measures and considerations, and there's quite a lot of options on the table. And we're expecting a very significant update pre-Christmas, so very excited to hear what this is going to be about. If we go on the REMA pillars, just to cover the different areas which REMA covers. So if we can go to the next slide. Essentially, REMA will want to combine appropriate wholesale market signals, ensuring that you have a significant investment in renewable capacity to move to this next wave of decarbonization, but this will need to be combined with investment in low carbon flexibility, such as hydrogen, long duration storage. Then, of course, ensuring that the system works through capacity adequacy and making sure that there's no outages. And finally, ensuring operability of the system in the context where you have a lot more intermittent generation. So now I will hand over to Tom, for a brief overview of what was discussed in our last REMA event, and then going into the impact of zonal market on renewables.
Thanks, Manon, and hello, everybody. So yeah, before we deep dive into the kind of core of the webinar, we just wanted to briefly recap our in-person event in September on REMA and the route to net zero. So a number of Baringa colleagues and industry stakeholders are present. Some of the key themes discussed were: one, that REMA is at the centre of a highly complex web of interrelated policy, which makes obviously a daunting graphic for policymakers at the top there. Basically, there's a lot to do, from first of a kind business models, retail market design, industrial policy, interconnectors. There's a lot to do, and basically REMA can't be looked at in isolation amongst all those policies. Secondly, we think to sort of consolidate and cut through all that complexity, there needs to be some overarching principles to come up with a design philosophy to achieve net zero with REMA, and we think that highlights a need for central system design. Obviously, we've seen the recent kind of commissioning of the ESO or FSO on the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan as a part of that. And while the market can still drive efficient operation and investment, there will undoubtedly be trade-offs on the kind of optimal pathways to both the net zero in the power sector in 2035 and the wider economy by 2050. Also discussed were measures on delinking the cost of renewables from the gas price with the green power pool, also around the kind of allocation of risk between developers and the consumer, and whether we should be subsidizing assets or just de-risking long-term contracts. And we also discussed interconnectors and multi-purpose interconnectors and the key role they'll play and need to be a key consideration of reform. So onto the next slide. There's a core section of the webinar. And the next slide again. Yeah. So we want to move on to the core section of the webinar. So initially, we want to outline our approach for the analysis that we've performed. So a key part of that is, of course, zonal pricing. There's a lot of debate around locational marginal pricing and its kind of benefits to the system, whether it's a help or a hindrance to net zero. And there's a huge amount of debate about that. And then within that, is it zonal pricing? How many zones? Is it nodal pricing? Again, different levels of complexity, different ability to kind of implement them in time for net zero. So we've taken the view of a good place to sit with the analysis is to use zonal pricing. So we've modelled 8 zones. These zones are broadly constructed from the key constraints across the GB system. So in Scotland, north of the B6 border, we have 3 zones. And then across England and Wales, we have another 5 zones, with another key constraint being at the SC1 border boundary in the south. So we've used our Baringa reference case capacity. So a quick plug for that, those of you who aren't aware of our reference case. So we have several hundred subscribers across Europe. Underpins a lot of billions of pounds of investment across Europe. We have a team of market experts who input very strong views on kind of near-term capacity, near-term demand, and in the longer term, we have Baringa modelled commodity costs, technology costs, and demand, which basically we then run a sort of least cost optimization to form a long-term capacity mix. Anyone who's interested to discuss that or wants to hear more, please contact any of us after the call. So yeah, we're using our Baringa reference case view. We then allocate capacity based on our kind of best knowledge in the longer term, where it sits across GB, and we do have the capability to kind of model more than 8 zones in Baringa. So if people are interested in that as well, please get in touch. And it's worth noting we're using our reference case. We're not re-optimizing our capacity based on the output of zonal pricing. And also we obviously run the pan-European model, so we can assess the impact on interconnected markets as well, which we'll dive into later in the webinar. So on to the next slide, please. So here we'll first present the impact of zonal pricing on renewable capture prices, kind of a key barometer for performance of renewables in different zones. So zonal pricing creates new supply and demand dynamics within a zone, leading to different price outcomes. And we have 2 kind of very divergent assets here. So offshore wind in Scotland, solar in the south of England behind that kind of SC1 border. So this chart represents those capture prices. You have the dashed line, which represents the sort of BAU counterfactual national wholesale market. And then you have the solid line, which represents once we've overlaid those boundary constraints onto the model and kind of rerun the model. In Scotland, we see a significant increase in wind capacity from, I think we double it between 2023 and 2035. So that creates kind of a cannibalization effect. And those constraints limit the ability of the wind to basically be exported down to the south and into Europe, and then through interconnectors into Europe. So it constrains the kind of demand side of those dynamics, and that leads to, as you can see, quite a stark reduction in the longer term capture price. In the south, we see kind of the reverse effect. So that constraint at the SC1 border basically limits the renewable kind of penetration into that zone, and then also kind of SC1 has lots of interconnection with France, so that zone kind of almost feels a bit like an extension of Central Europe with higher prices seen and therefore higher capture prices. So what does that mean? So you could say that there's an incentive there to build projects in the south, but to reach net zero, we need to build gigawatts of projects, and offshore wind is probably our best route to doing that in GB. And Scotland in the North Sea, North Sea is one of the best areas to do that. Like really high load factors, best onshore wind projects as well, floating offshore wind, etc. So, and this is at the extremities of the system. So this would indicate, so like from a system level, what does this indicate? So the kind of difference in the capture prices there between the unconstrained and the constrained run shows that the offshore wind is providing kind of less value to the system in the north, but that could be a signal for potentially demand, hydrogen demand derivatives or industrial demand. But obviously the degree to which, you know, we can relocate demand or construct big hydrogen kind of value chains is linked to first of a kind business models, industrial policy, and then beyond control, global macroeconomic conditions and just the general economy. So to the degree to which that happens is obviously uncertain. Of course, this is also a big signal for transmission investment. So if you want to bring cheaper power into the south, where we have most of our demand, then you're going to need to build more wires. And that would benefit the UK economy generally. And then from an investor perspective, this potentially increases the uncertainty and market risk on long-term revenues. Most offshore wind projects are, of course, funded by CFD auctions, and this increased kind of long-term risk and uncertainty can raise the cost of capital for developers and potentially imprise a greater need for some kind of government support. And on the next slide, we'll dive a bit further into that. So the impact of zonal pricing on CFDs. So CFD contracts are currently 15-year contracts, a fixed price received for energy generated, and that price is achieved at competitive auctions. CFDs have, of course, been in the news recently. The latest auction round, AR5, was successful for onshore technologies, but was more challenging for offshore developers, with price caps and budgets effectively ruling those projects out in this kind of high inflation, high interest rate, and tight supply chain environment. The latest news, I think, from last week indicates a higher strike price for the next auction round. I think a higher price cap for the next auction round of I think around £100 a megawatt hour in today's money. So several developers, and it's a good signal for several developers, and there's many gigawatts out there, you know, in the pipeline. So we'll likely see a healthy and competitive auction next year, depending on the budgets, which hopefully will represent like value for money for the consumer. And if you're interested in learning more about those dynamics, then obviously you should definitely talk to Manon and her team, who are experts in this space. So back onto the chart here. So clearly costs have risen for offshore wind farms, and here we're looking at like what would be the bid level impact of a move to zonal pricing. So if we step through that waterfall chart, firstly we have the capex. Obviously offshore wind is a very high capex technology. That just shows the importance of that cost of capital in getting these projects online. And then we have the OPEX, which is not to be ignored. And then we have, so as I mentioned, there's CFD contracts are 15 years. After the CFD contract, the projects are exposed to the market prices in their, well, at the moment in the national wholesale market. And that allows you to kind of bring down your bid level based on your view on those kind of revenues in the post-CFD world, like into the 2030s and 40s. And obviously we can help you to understand those risks. And then we arrive at a national bid level. So then if we look at the national bid level and then we step across, we're then saying, what would a move to zonal pricing do to those long-term revenues and therefore to your bid price? And we see a 10% uplift. So that in and of itself is a significant increase. And that's not to account for also any kind of increased cost. You might want to recover your capital earlier, so there's a higher cost of capital. So there's multiple risks there, which we've not considered all of them. And then an additional risk is that the CFDs are currently reconciled against the national wholesale price. In a move to zonal pricing, there's obviously a couple of options you could do. You could continue that, like reconciling it against the national wholesale price, or you could do it against the zonal wholesale price. Here we're representing the kind of scale of the impact of if those contracts are reconciled against the national wholesale price, i.e. all contracts reconciled against the same price series. And what that does is it introduces a new risk, which is basis risk, which has a significant impact on bid levels. And this is putting a lot of upward pressure on potentially upward pressure on these projects, maybe decreasing their competitiveness, and the value that the consumer gets from these projects is less clear. So government will certainly have to design CFDs to work in parallel with any move to zonal pricing. There is a question around where market risk best sits for these projects. An important point around, we don't want to be subsidizing these projects, we just want to be de-risking them. And there's a couple of things on the table that could be introduced. So one, you could extend the length of these contracts to kind of minimize that long-term market risk. Other options are that you could obviously expose these assets more to that kind of zonal price signal, but of course that might result in less use of our kind of great offshore asset we have in GB, and potentially the kind of locational signal of CFDs could be basically from some sort of central planning with those kind of longer term contracts. And it'll be really interesting to see where government ends up on with reform, and definitely sort of one to watch for developers. And if people have concerns, then please get in touch. On to Vikash now to talk about flexibility.
Great, thank you, John, and thank you for kind of listening in. We're going to kind of switch to flexibility now, and we're going to look at kind of gas and kind of battery storage as illustrative technologies. And within this section, we'll be looking both at the impacts of wholesale market reform, i.e. a zonal wholesale market, but also impacts of kind of capacity market reform. So starting with gas assets, what you've done here is we've analyzed wholesale margins for GB-wide kind of CCGT fleet, but also for a mid-merit CCGT in Zone X as an illustration. And we've also compared wholesale energy margins in a national versus a kind of a zonal wholesale world. And you can see the GB-wide fleet is kind of represented through the pink lines, and that mid-merit CCGT in Zone X is represented through the blue lines. And with the dotted lines representing a national, i.e. the current market design, and the solid lines kind of being the new potential world, the zonal market. And generally speaking, what we see is lower wholesale margins for gas plant in the system. And this is quite interesting. The reason this is happening is generally we see lower utilization of these assets in a zonal world. This is due to kind of greater demand supply self-sufficiency within the zones. However, this is not a universal effect. It will vary by zone depending on the local merit order. And there would also be some broader interesting effects to consider. For example, the role of kind of bidding behavior in a zonal versus a national wholesale market might be quite different. The level of competition between these different assets is going to be different. So some of these effects might kind of vary by zone. The key takeaway is lower margins for gas assets generally, but they're likely to be significant variations by zone. Next slide. We then look at storage, kind of similar comparison, national versus zonal wholesale market, GB-wide battery fleet versus a 2-hour battery in Zone X. And again, we kind of see some really interesting effects, particularly in Zone X. We see higher margins for the 2-hour battery, while for the GB-wide fleet, we're kind of seeing lower margins. And this suggests two things. One, the higher margins in Zone X is because of higher peak off-peak spread that we see for batteries playing into it, and a lot of that is driven by kind of Zone X being located close to demand center, which is driving that kind of spread. The contrasting result that we see for GB as a whole effectively indicates that in a zonal market, there are going to be greater locational incentives, which will basically mean that some of this capacity will relocate, i.e., from the zones with less value to zones with high value. So the key takeaway is higher margins for batteries in zones close to demand centers, and generally you kind of start seeing those locational incentives playing a role in terms of where storage locates. Next slide. So far, we have been looking at the impacts of a zonal wholesale market on flexibility technologies, and before that, renewables. Let's now look at capacity market. Capacity market reform is one of the significant levers under REMA that policymakers have to ensure there's enough capacity in the system so that the lights don't go out, but also serve as a mechanism to deliver investment in new low carbon flexible capacity. You can see the 2x2 matrix on the right, which is effectively looking at the interaction between wholesale market reform, national versus a zonal wholesale market, and capacity market reform, a single pod, which is the current market design, versus kind of split pods for capacity market, which we're calling kind of the low carbon pod and the high carbon pod. It is worth noting that this is not the only CM reform option on the table. For example, the capacity market reform could consider more explicitly, kind of storage characteristics around flexibility, the length of duration. However, for the purpose of illustration here, we focused on capacity market reform being signaled through a low versus a high carbon pod. And what we do is then using this kind of framework, we look at the profitability of gas and storage technologies. Next slide, please. So under current market design, the national wholesale market, a single capacity market, what we see is there's likely to be elevated capacity market prices in this BAU world. And the reason it's likely to stay elevated is because there are significant new build requirements, new build technologies on the system, recovery of capex will be required. However, there could be very significant fluctuations year on year. There could be years with lower prices due to limited or no new build. But on the whole, the key takeaway is more elevated CM prices, but this may not be a stable trajectory. Next slide. So let's now look at what happens in a different world, i.e., if we switch to, let's say, a zonal wholesale market and a split capacity market, and we see some really interesting effects here. I think the most prominent one is the significant wedge in CM prices you see between the low carbon pod, the dotted blue line, and the high carbon pod, which is the solid blue line. Generally, the low carbon pod clears at higher prices. This is due to new build requirements, new technologies clearing, recovery of capex, associated cost of capital required. On the other hand, the high carbon pod generally clears at significantly lower prices, and they're kind of decreasing over time. This is due to limited or no new build requirements on the system. And this is mainly about recovery of kind of missing money for existing plant in the system. So what this suggests is if a split capacity market can create fairly sharp investment signals for new low carbon flexible capacity, but could potentially dampen signals for existing capacity to stay online. And that's equally important, at least for the next decade, from a security of supply perspective. There are also some kind of broader kind of design considerations that come with it. For example, the government will have to set demand for the low carbon pod versus the high carbon pod, and that can have a very significant bearing on CM price levels that you see for those spots. So take the example of, let's say there's not enough supply to meet demand in the low carbon pod. Naturally, that will drive higher prices in that pod. But if that unmet demand then needs to be met through the high carbon pod, because you still need to ensure there's enough capacity from a security of supply perspective, that could also significantly drive higher price outcomes for the high carbon pod. So these are some interesting effects that will need to be considered in this market design. The key takeaway is if you have a split capacity market, it does create strong investment signals for new low carbon capacity. Next slide. So then trying to bring this all together, what could this mean for the profitability of kind of gas and battery storage? What we see here is for existing gas on the system, it does create a fairly significant, downward pressure on the business case and the gross margins for gas assets. And this is largely due to the split capacity market and the high carbon pod clearing at lower CM prices. On the other hand, for 2-hour battery storage, you see a marginally positive impact due to kind of these changes. The reason it's marginal is even though capacity market prices are higher, 2-hour battery storage is quite heavily derated from a security of supply perspective, so the upside is quite limited. But there could be other longer duration technologies which could kind of experience greater upsides from this. So the key takeaway from this section is that a split capacity market does create strong signals, but probably kind of dampen signals for existing capacity to stay online. Existing capacity is quite key from a security of supply perspective, especially in the transition to net zero, and that does need to be considered in any kind of market reform package. We'll pass on to Tom now to discuss European markets.
Thanks, Vikash. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, our in-person event, kind of interconnectors were a hot topic of conversation, and multi-purpose interconnectors were raised as an important consideration for future market design. So there are highly ambitious plans of how to most efficiently use North Sea infrastructure, but a lot of these questions boil down to economics and how the market operates, and REMA will certainly influence that. The GB has an ambition to build 18 gigawatts by around 2030. And in our reference case, we're a bit more conservative than that on build. We build around 13.5. We eventually do get to 18, but kind of pushing closer to 2040. So this map outlines the relative delta of price in different zones and markets in GB and Europe. So more pink is a greater reduction in price relative to the counterfactual, and then darker blue is a greater increase in price. So what we can see is quite a significant changing of the dynamics. Effectively, where an interconnector is connected, it is now exposed to the local price in that zone, which obviously therefore influences the trade and the congestion rent that interconnector can receive, but also influences the prices in those markets. And I think the visual map on the left kind of shows you quite clearly that impact. And you can see the new kind of divide, sort of north-south divide in GB in terms of the price of power from what we've discussed previously. Lots of wind in the north that's constrained and can't get into that sort of SC5 zone. Also, we've got that zone on the east coast, which is basically the South North Sea and has a lot of wind connected into that zone. So as you can see, like lots of interconnection between France and that zone in SC1. So that, as I mentioned earlier, it kind of becomes a bit of an extension in terms of price of Central Europe and really creates a stark difference. That kind of lack of ability to access that wind in Central Europe raises the prices, and then conversely, that's kind of opposite for Ireland, which connects a bit more in the north, and Norway, of course, which kind of sees those kind of lower priced zones. So over time, what this means is GB exports a lot less of its wind, so the wind is consumed domestically, and of course that has a considerable impact across Europe. I think it's really important then, therefore, that like interconnector developers and other investors in Europe stay close to what's going on in GB, and likewise vice versa, that there's kind of involvement and collaboration to ensure that we can efficiently develop these projects in the North Sea, and that we can kind of work together to reach net zero, which is beneficial for both markets. So yeah, that's that. So I'll pass back to Vikash for summary.
Great. So I think let's move to summarizing the key takeaways. I think the one clear message is market reform in any shape or form will significantly alter the future outlook for different technologies and also for the system as a whole. So that's key to keep in mind. Let's take each of these technology types in turn. Renewables, as we have demonstrated, wholesale pricing can change quite significantly if there's market reform. Even with that kind of market reform, there would still be investment support or a mechanism required to ensure, kind of investment is happening at pace and scale. And I think any market reform package will have to consider this trade-off. Is it a market-driven investment case in renewables with de-risking of revenues, or is it more expansion of the current CFD mechanism in place, potentially with incremental changes to ensure the scale and pace of investment is needed? Looking at low carbon flexibility, we did see that, particularly for storage, it starts creating kind of a zonal market, can start creating locational signals in terms of where you locate. But even with that change, it is likely that an investment support mechanism like a capacity market, a split capacity market, may be needed. That's not the only option on the table. There are alternative options that can be looked at to kind of incentivize that investment. Moving to then gas, I think what we clearly saw was, especially the split capacity market reform can create fairly kind of significant risks for existing gas to stay up online. Their incentives are likely to be reduced, but we do know that there's 30 gigawatts of gas currently on the system. We do know we have an ambitious power sector target for 2035, which is only kind of 12 years away. We also know that the deployment of some of these new low carbon flexible technologies will take a bit of time. So apologies. So kind of the role of gas to kind of ensure it stays open, provides a security of supply during the transition period is going to be key. And there's no easy answer for it. It's a complex one that any market reform package will need to tackle. And finally, interconnectors, as kind of Tom pointed out, it starts creating that north-south divide, which has significant implications for European markets. So obviously the business case for interconnectors changes. Also the business case for different technologies in neighboring markets also changes, and that will need to be kept in mind. This sums up our presentation, and can we be ready for Q&A? Manon, back to you.
Yeah, thank you both. That was quite a lot of content. So yeah, please everyone type your questions in the chat and we'll try to answer them. While there's no questions, I'll kick us off. So REMA is obviously quite a broad set of measures and covers quite a lot of aspects, some of which we've touched upon. How long do you think that this is going to take before the full set of measures is implemented and active in the GB market?
I can take that. So I think obviously if we've got get some kind of indication in the next few weeks, hopefully pre-Christmas, of the level of change. Well, it's still a consultation, so there won't be any decision made at this point. So they're still going to go out to industry, understand the views, and it's obviously going to be a lot of diverse views and complications. So you wouldn't expect a decision at the earliest until late next year. And then once you've got that, depending on what they choose to do, if it was zonal pricing, it's a bit quicker, but any move to nodal pricing would probably be unlikely to see that until the very late 2020s in a kind of implementation. But some of the more kind of changes to the capacity market and CFD, potentially those changes could be implemented a bit sooner, but still we're looking at BAU for the next few years at least, and we have to build a lot of gigawatts of infrastructure by that point.
I think probably just one build is that there would still be incremental changes like the one around the CFD, i.e. it's the current mechanism reflecting on the learning from AR5, that upward adjustment and administrative strike prices is again a signal of incremental changes which can drive that investment and can add scale potentially on offshore wind to be able to possibly meet the 2035 power sector target.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'm just seeing quite a lot of questions pop up, so I'm going to take one from Andrew, because I think that's a point we covered at the start, but keen to develop a little bit on this. So, is it our view that zonal pricing will be the most likely option compared to national or nodal?
Let me take that. I kind of think that we think that nodal pricing has its benefits, and I think it can work great from an operational perspective. But even with that change, you still need the investment mechanisms to be there to drive the pace of investment. And that naturally creates that trade-off of around how much do you kind of prioritize in the next decade versus the next 2 decades. You know, this balance between operational and investment signals and the scale of change that you create in the industry. So it does feel like, national pricing with incremental improvements or zonal pricing with associated, investment signals is probably could be a direction of travel which could make the power sector target achievable by 2035.
Thank you. And I think another one was, obviously we focused on wholesale and capacity market reforms. So have you guys looked at some of the other value pools? And in relation to that, I think there was a question on the BM and how it would change, and any interactions with zonal and nodal pricing.
Should I take that, Tom?
Yeah, go on. You start.
So I think it's a great question, and that is something we have looked at in terms of kind of simulating the balancing mechanism in GB from an energy and constraints perspective, and what could that mean for system costs as a whole, and what could that mean for the profitability of different technologies. For the purpose of simplicity and illustration, we have not, we've kind of basically have not kind of said that out in this webinar. But I think in principle, what you'd see is, for context, one of the biggest drivers, the argument for nodal pricing is, that there are increasing constrained costs that are being kind of basically settled through the BM, through the ESO taking action in that market. In a move to a zonal kind of pricing world, you'd see some of those actions being resolved within the market itself, i.e., curtailment of renewables in Scotland, which can't travel through the transmission network, will already be reflected in in that zonal market, and therefore, I think the BM can probably return more towards what was originally designed to do, i.e., effectively treat the more residual kind of demand supply imbalances in the system, and kind of reduce the constraint cost that National Grid has to incur as a system operator.
Yeah, and I think that ties in also with one of the questions on the distortions from the low carbon support mechanisms in the wholesale market dispatch. How significant do you think those are at the moment? And I guess what will change under the new, the new setup?
I mean, it's certainly true that in our kind of national wholesale market, you get less hours of prices close to zero than in a zonal market. So in a zone with higher wind and some constraints, you're going to get certainly more increased kind of frequency of those zero priced hours, which brings into play that kind of bidding behavior from a distortion both in the CFD. Obviously, there's been changes to the CFD to limit that ability to bid negatively, but there is kind of other things as well. So REGO pricing, for example, now is very high, which is again creating kind of, it's like a legacy, well, an old policy that was introduced that is now kind of pricing very high. I think the price of REGO at the moment is around £30 a megawatt hour, which is 10 times what I think it has been historically, and that again can create new distortions around that zero price, and we would have more frequent zero pricing definitely in zones that have got more wind.
I think it is likely that around the CFD, that kind of incentive to participate in the market and respond to operational signals, it is quite likely that there would be some at least incremental improvements to ensure, even if you're kind of procuring kind of capacity through the CFD at scale, that there are improvements in the design to ensure that some of the operational incentives are maintained, rather than kind of spilling into the market, even when the need is not there for the system.
So moving to a different asset class, there was a clarification question on the interconnector work around what the counterfactual is. Is the counterfactual, no interconnectors, or is it national versus zonal? I assume it's the latter, Tom, but if you can clarify that.
Yeah, so apologies if I didn't make that clear, Matthew. It's the counterfactual is basically our kind of pan-EU reference case model, which is an interconnected model across all markets, and then we're just overlaying the transmission constraints within GB and rerunning that kind of dispatch model. So it creates new constraints within GB, which changes the prices in zones, and therefore interconnectors connected into zones see different prices, and therefore those interconnectors will operate differently, and that will impact prices in neighboring markets. So that's the counterfactual.
Okay, thank you. So keeping on the questions related to specific asset classes, there's a question around the impact of decarbonized gas generation in a zonal system.
Madeline, kind of what is the question? Is that just a general question on the role of gas?
What would be the general impact of zonal on such kind of generation class, so decarbonized gas generation?
Yes, so kind of I think we kind of briefly illustrated that impact in terms of, you know, if you have existing kind of high carbon kind of gas on the system, we're generally kind of seeing reduced utilization, kind of greater kind of demand supply balance within the zone. But that is under the simplistic assumption of effectively kind of the bidding behavior kind of being similar in a national versus a zonal wholesale market. One of the key kind of considerations in a move to a more locational world would be is the level of competition between kind of different assets in the zone and in neighboring zones, and what could that mean for market power. So I think that's a key consideration, which has been, I would say, simplified here, but will be a key feature to ensure the future market is fit for design. So there could be you know, kind of zones where with limited competition, gas assets could potentially capture more value in a zonal world versus a wholesale kind of versus a national world, while in other zones where there's a lot of competition, like there's a lot of kind of gas CCGTs in zone X, in that zone, for example, the level of competition is likely to be more, and therefore generally we would expect kind of lower utilization of those assets.
I think to build on that in the question, I think he specifically mentions like anaerobic digestion, and I think obviously sort of burning biogas for power, there's obviously a lot of subsidy in that at the moment, and when those kind of ROCs expire, there's a like you will then be exposed to your kind of short run marginal cost of generating that biogas, or the opportunity benefit of using that biogas elsewhere, and effectively that might kind of expose you in the local merit order and push you a bit further out, so you'd be, you know, dispatching less, otherwise the asset could be making a loss.
And I think another one on another asset class, so it's relating to the impact of zonal pricing on batteries in specific zones. So please tell me if these haven't been modeled, but particularly B2 and B4, if you have any direction of travel that you can mention, or if have we just looked at certain zones? And
we have looked at all zones. I think generally, if you're not in SC1 and X, where you've got kind of lower demand, you of course see if you're a battery in Scotland, you're of course going to see kind of a lot lower pricing. Lower at the bottom end of your spread is going to be lower because of the higher renewable penetration, but then also because we've got a lot of renewable generation at peak as well, with wind kind of often correlating with peak, you kind of have that lower peak pricing, which of course kind of reduces those margins. But I think it's a bit more nuance on that. Like certain kind of years and certain projects will obviously be able to make more money, and it depends on how the kind of evolution of the capacity mix and demand and constraints.
And I think that point I made earlier around bidding behavior in that market, it's not just a feature for gas assets. For any kind of flexible asset in that market, the demand supply balance, level of competition can kind of change some of these outcomes, which are kind of more based on the fundamental demand supply stack and what could that mean for utilization and value.
Thank you. And so now a question on my favorite topic on the CFD allocations and how these would work in a zonal market. I think that I'm going to start, but please guys jump in. I think that there's quite a lot of uncertainty around whether it would be run at the national or zonal level. And I think in Tom's presentation, he explained that the national level would introduce significant basis risk for developers, which would obviously be quite a big risk, especially for some of the generators in Scotland. But I think it's also probably going to be part of a wider package of measures, and there could be interactions with the TNUoS as well. So I think that both of those set of metrics would probably need to be looked at together, because if there's more pressure on the location through the CFD, perhaps some of the other pressures might be loosened slightly. So it's quite hard to tell at this point. But yeah, Vikash, Tom, do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, I agree with you, man, and I think they kind of ultimately that design will also impact the design of the CFD, whether it's national procurement, is it national procurement with some regional targets? I think the key principle is there's a lot of offshore wind in Scotland that has to be part of the solution to get to net zero, and you can't possibly just say introduce basis risk, lower capture prices in Scotland, unless you kind of significantly invest in the transmission network with a clear signal and responsibility around that. Otherwise, it kind of basically risks cannibalizing kind of the Scottish offshore wind potential, which again does not get you to net zero.
So now I'm seeing a few questions relating to our zonal assumptions and modeling. So what level of transmission did we consider for the different zones, and how did we define those zones?
So we defined those zones based on what we've. So I think it was initially when we built the model was the electricity tenure statement. We looked at the kind of most constrained boundaries across GB, and that's kind of a representative view of yes, the most significant constraints in the GB system. So it's kind of a first stage of analysis of what the impact would be of zonal pricing. We can model more zones than that. I think we have the capability to model around 17 currently in our modeling suite, and we're developing that, and we'll respond to any kind of developments in government, and we do have the capability to do that. And we align quite well with sort of NOAA plus the HND. I think in our reference case, we have the same level of HVDC capacity by 2037 than the HND. So that's kind of we do broadly track that, and then in the long run, we build additional reinforcements as we kind of grow out into the sort of 2040s and 2050s.
And I think this kind of raises that, you know, if you think about the current power price and kind of the key drivers, you don't think about transmission investment as a driver because it's a national wholesale price. So in terms of the level of transmission investment, the pace of it in any locational market will be one of the key drivers of investment, which again kind of has a separate process in terms of how it's kind of done. Obviously, there are kind of measures being put in place to accelerate, you know, kind of that investment happening in 5 years rather than 10 to 15 years. But that's the additional driver and risk and opportunity that creates for different technologies in a more locational world.
Great. And we have a question further up in the chat around the impact of these policies around the future technologies, and their deployment, so long duration storage, hydrogen, CCUS. Yeah, if you can elaborate a little bit on that, especially, for example, for the CM.
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting one. I think this kind of sits within that theme of it's not going to be REMA on its own, which will deliver net zero. It does need to interact with a broader suite of policy measures. We know that, you know, for gas CCS, there's the DPA mechanism, which may need to evolve over time. We know that for hydrogen to power, a business model is being considered, which will interact with the hydrogen production and storage business models. We know that reform within the capacity market is being considered to incentivize different forms of low carbon technology. And I think that's where I would say at a more principled level, a choice needs to be made around which of these mechanisms at play, what is the role? Is it more kind of contracted infrastructure delivery, or is it a more market-led approach? So I think these policies do need to come together in a coherent and sensible way to give investors the signal they need to kind of invest and develop assets.
Thank you. There was also a question around interzonal trading for batteries and any impact of these policies on that.
I think that's a great question. I think this is around it's linked to the point around the level of liquidity, kind of the size of the zones, the different market participants, their bidding behavior. So I think that is going to be one of the key considerations in terms of, we already know that even in a national market, forward liquidity beyond the first few years is quite limited. The way investment in renewables is happening through the CFD reduces the incentives for basically trading ahead in the forward markets. Again, reform options being considered there. So I think that's going to be one of the key considerations as well market in terms of that balance of liquidity in the market to ensure there's sufficient competition and trading of power.
Great. And I think I'm going to pick one last question, just conscious of time and kind of closing the webinar. And I think it's a great concluding question. So what impact do you foresee for the investment in generation while there is still significant uncertainty around the direction of travel of REMA and the outcome? So obviously sitting in the shoes of developers, today who need to make those investment decisions. Yes. What do you forecast there?
Yeah, so I think this is where I think it's a great question and a very loaded one. And I think it's gonna depend, vary by technology. For example, kind of the more classic battery storage, significant investment activity in the market, and that is likely to continue even with this uncertainty, because again, that's one of the key technologies to contribute to decarbonization. There might be more locational incentives, capacity market reform might work in your favor because you're a new low carbon technology. For some of the larger infrastructure projects like gas CCS, hydrogen to power, long duration energy storage, which are less mature, a clear signal on direction of travel is going to be quite key, because you're in a bit of a hiatus on, do I develop? How much do I develop? What could that business case look like? How am I going to interact with these kind of different policies? And you need a more clear signal so that you can actually get to low carbon flexible capacity quickly. And I think the third one is your existing flexible capacity in the system. I think it's fair to say the policy signals are mixed. Some might argue, kind of in policy circle, that it's anti-gas. In other places, we still have the term subject to security of supply, all of this kind of power sector targets. That's a recognition that you do need existing capacity in the system to ensure the lights don't go out. We've done some analysis kind of recently, which suggests that you do need that capacity for a period of time as a transition technology. Otherwise, you create a very significant risk around security of supply. So, and I think that's the area which is kind of more like the most uncertain in terms of what is my role? How do I investment refurbishment? How do I stay online for the next 10 years?
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone also for a great set of questions. And thanks Vikash and Tom for all the insights. I think to conclude this webinar, it's fair to say that REMA will have really wide-ranging impacts. The zonal market will have, or if it is introduced, will have significant distributional effects for generators, depending on where they're located. A split point CM would also have wide-ranging impact, and this is also not considering all the other set of measures which would come together in order to form a package of measures. So at Baringa, we can help you understand those measures, both through undertaking qualitative and quantitative analysis. I hope that you found this session useful. If you would like a copy of the slides, you can reach out to one of your speakers today, and our colleague Louis as well, who has been leading a lot of this work from a DESNES perspective. So you can reach out on LinkedIn or by email and we'll send you the pack. In terms of what you will get by email in the next couple of days, we can go to the next slide. So you will receive an email with the recording of this webinar and the discussion. We will also send you the write-up of our recent REMA panel, which could be helpful if you haven't been able to attend, as well as the thought piece, which I mentioned on CFDs. In the meanwhile, yeah, please register to our newsletter. So if you found this useful and you would like more news around our webinars and our thought leadership. So yeah, this is the end of our webinar. Thank you all for coming and have a great day.